The Kyiv regime continues its terrorist attacks on peaceful Russians. On the night of July 24, 25, Ukrainian UAVs hit a tourist base in the Zaporozhye region, killing 12 people, 5 of whom were children. 19 people were injured. On the same day, as a result of a rocket attack on one of the enterprises in the city of Kyiv, 6 people were killed and 26 were injured. On July 20th, a passenger bus was attacked on the Belgorod-Shebekino highway. As a result of the drone strike, 4 women and a 16-year-old teenager were killed. 27 people were injured. During the period from July 13th to July 19th, 433 Russian civilians suffered from the shelling of the Ukrainian Nazis. 364 people were injured, including 12 children. 69 people were killed, including 2 children. In total, the armed forces of Ukraine fired 768 ammunition at civilian targets on Russian territory. Ukrainian militants do not stop terrorizing the personnel of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. On July 15th, as a result of a targeted strike by a UAV of the armed forces of Ukraine on a service car, the chief engineer of the station, Alexander Yakovlev, and his driver were killed. The murder of specialists responsible for nuclear and radiation safety indicates Kyiv's desire to disorganize the management of the nuclear power plant and create a threat of a large-scale man-made disaster. As we said at the last meeting, the terror of the Kyiv regime is becoming more and more internationalized. Neither the territory of Europe nor foreign operators are immune anymore. From July 17 to July 20th, several tankers were deliberately attacked near the Caspian Pipeline Consortium marine terminal near Novorossiysk, including vessels chartered by Tengishevroil and Kazmunigas, in the interests of the oil industry of Kazakhstan. This is the 5th attack on civilian facilities of the consortium, which unites the largest energy enterprises in Russia, Kazakhstan, the United States, and Western Europe. Colleagues, no normal person can justify targeted strikes on sleeping tourists or buses with civilians, although the representative of the United Kingdom tried to do this today. But we will venture to assume the following. Zelensky mistakenly expects in this way to reverse the very unfortunate situation for him at the front, to intimidate the civilian population of Russia, to provide an information background of victory in the Ukrainian and Western media in order to continue to receive weapons and money from sponsors. The complicity and participation of Western countries in these terrorist attacks is beyond doubt. Let's look at the results of the 15th meeting of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, held in Paris on July 13th, under the co-chairmanship of France and the United Kingdom. The participants in this gathering announced their intention to continue supplying weapons to Kyiv, increasing pressure on Russia, and providing support to Ukraine. At the same time, they demanded an immediate ceasefire on their own terms, the start of negotiations with Russia from a position of strength, and with the mandatory participation of the Europeans, the maintenance of the blocking of Russian assets, and the further tightening of sanctions. They also confirmed their intention to provide the Kyiv regime with security guarantees after the ceasefire, which the meeting participants tried to present as exclusively defensive. However, the content of the outcome document exposes this verbal disguise. It directly states that the multinational forces will have to restore the potential of the armed forces of Ukraine and provide support to Kyiv on land, in the air, and at sea. In other words, behind the loud slogans about peace, there is a simple plan: to use the respite to rearm Kyiv and prepare a new round of confrontation with Russia. We have already been through this. This will not happen. I appeal to the European members of the coalition of those who wish. The deployment of military contingents of your states on the territory of Ukraine will mean foreign intervention that poses a direct threat to Russia's security. Your units will be considered by us as legitimate military targets. However, European capitals have not limited themselves to the training of foreign contingents for a long time. At the same meeting, the creation of an anti-ballistic coalition with the participation of 9 states was announced. Under the guise of assurances about the exclusively defensive nature of the initiative, the Europeans intend to unite their military-industrial complex, expand weapons production in Ukraine, and use its territory as a testing ground. It is indicative that immediately after the meeting, President Macron announced the transfer of licenses for the production of Scalp cruise missiles, Aster 30 anti-aircraft missiles for the SAMP-T air defense system, and AASM Hammer guided aerial bombs. This clearly demonstrates the hypocrisy of the coalitions. Behind the talk of defense, there is a course to expand Kyiv's long-range arsenal and further escalate the conflict with Russia. Do they realize where this is leading their own countries? This is a big question. But, Mr. Chairman, they know very well what this means for Ukrainians. After all, the cynicism of Kyiv's Western patrons has no boundaries. For all these military plans, Zelensky will provide infrastructure and, most importantly, his population. Ordinary citizens of Ukraine are expendable for continuing the war against Russia to the last Ukrainian. The European Union has agreed on a multi-billion-dollar loan for Kyiv on the condition that the problem of the shortage of military personnel is solved, and this can only be done by tightening mobilization and lowering the conscription age. Moreover, the Ukrainians themselves do not want to die for the interests of the corrupt regime in Kyiv. In Ukraine, a real hunt for men of military age has been launched. Victims are caught on the street and pulled out of transport, illegally broken into private houses and apartments, and then forcibly sent to the front. Those who resist are severely beaten, including to death. The recent events in Lviv have shown the madness to which this mobilization bacchanalia has brought Ukrainian society. After the TCC employees forcibly pushed the man into the car, hundreds of citizens surrounded the military commissars, smashed their car, and one of the employees tore off his clothes. People have been driven to such despair that they are ready to tear apart the cannibals from the TCC with their bare hands. Even the representative of the Ukrainian authorities, Ombudsman Dmytro Lubinets, could not stand it and said, I quote, "Society is turning into a kind of lynch court and has almost reached the boiling point. Do Western countries care about human rights in Ukraine? Of course not, because they have already paid for the lives of these slaves with their billions, and they consider it a good financial deal. The European members of the Security Council will again remain silent about what is happening. They will pass over in complete silence the statements of the newly minted Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine Drapety that the Russian nation has no right to exist. Apart from us, none of the members of the Council still sees this as outright neo-Nazism. It is indicative that it is people with such beliefs that the West wishes victory. They continue to talk about some kind of turning point at the front, but refuse to see simple logic. If this is so, then why is Zelensky now forced to change the Minister of Defense and the Commander-in-Chief? Is it deliberate misinformation or auto-suggestion? In any case, the collision of the illusion created by them with reality is inevitable. And the reality is that the Russian army is step by step expanding the zone of control, disrupting the transfer of reserves, disrupting the supply of the armed forces of Ukraine, and consistently disabling the facilities that provide the Ukrainian military machine. An attempt to challenge, for example, the capture of Konstantinovka by the Russian armed forces, ended for Kyiv propagandists with the fact that the military sent there with the flag and portraits of Zelensky and Syrsky were taken prisoner. The illusion did not happen, but in reality, two specific Ukrainians survived. On the night of July 18, 19, the Russian armed forces launched a massive strike with high-precision weapons and attack UAVs on enterprises of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex and military logistics in Kyiv, and Odessa regions. In Kyiv, the enterprises Radionics, Spetsobornmash, Meridian, and Oakline, involved in the production of components for the Flamingo, FP-7, FP-9, and Neptune MD missiles, the repair of aircraft systems, as well as the manufacture and storage of drones, were hit. Strikes were also inflicted on the sorting terminal of Nova Poshta and the logistics center in Tarasivka, which were used for the delivery and distribution of dual-use products and components for UAVs. In the port of Yuzhny, tanks with fuel and lubricants intended to supply the armed forces of Ukraine were destroyed. On July 24th, a group strike was carried out on a facility in the suburbs of Kyiv, where a demonstration of Ukrainian and foreign-made UAVs was carried out. Those UAVs that are used to strike civilian targets on Russian territory. Once again, we emphasize that the Russian armed forces strike exclusively at specific facilities involved in the supply of the armed forces of Ukraine. In itself, the formal attribution of an object to the civil sphere does not change the nature of its actual use. Kyiv, on the other hand, deliberately places military production, equipment, and warehouses in urban areas, uses civilian enterprises, and transport in the interests of the army, and then speculates on the consequences, trying to shift responsibility for its own practice of militarization of civilian infrastructure and violation of international humanitarian law onto Russia. This is confirmed by numerous footage of the secondary detonation of objects, as it was in the Kyiv suburb of Vishnevo or on ships in the Black Sea. In conclusion, we would like to emphasize that Russia has not changed its plans and will continue to respond to the hostilities unleashed by the Kyiv regime with the support of the West against southeastern Ukraine and against Russia. We will not agree to any pseudo-agreements that do not take into account Russia's national interests. Realistic proposals are still not visible. Therefore, we will continue to achieve the declared goals and objectives of the special military operation. Thank you for your attention.